We had a chance to ask President Trump about a new superpower joining this fight on the Iranian side of Epic Fury.
President Trump, it sounds like the Russians are helping Iran target and attack Americans now.
That's an easy problem compared to what we're doing here. I mean, but can I be honest? It's just, I have a lot of respect for you. You've always been very nice to me. What a stupid question that is to be asking at this time. We're talking about something else. Can we keep this maybe a little bit?
And just a few minutes ago, the Iranians confirmed Russia is helping.
Are you receiving any help from Russia?
Well, we have a strategic partnership with Russia.
So that's a yes?
And, well, a military cooperation between Iran and Russia is not something new. It's not a secret. It has been in the past, and it's still there and will continue in the future.
General David Petraeus, retired four-star general. What should President Trump do about this?
Well, he should ask Congress to pass the sanctions bill that is in the Senate. Senator Lindsey Graham has led the effort, very close to President Trump, of course. He has over 90 out of 100 senators supporting it. It would be a very powerful signal to Russia. It would complement what the EU has done, which has been very impressive in this regard as well. And I think it's long since time that the sanctions are slapped on Russia, especially now that apparently they're providing the intelligence, which is so very important to the targeting that Iran does. They do not have the kind of intelligence that Russia can share with them and is apparently, and that explains some of the accuracy of the missiles and the drone strikes.
And Epic Fury has been going on for more than a week. We've already seen a part of the Pentagon playbook that we've never seen before, the part where the U.S. has reverse engineered some of these lethal Iranian drones. Listen to this.
You used to always hear, we're shooting down a $50,000 drone with a $2 million missile. These days, we're spending a lot of time shooting down $100,000 drones with $10,000 weapons from ours. So that's one aspect of it. Lucas, indispensable. As many of you know, and if you don't know, this was an original Iranian drone design. We captured it, pulled the guts out, sent it back to America, put a little Made America on it, brought it back here.
General, how often does the United States military reverse engineer a weapon to use it against the people who invented it?
Pretty rarely, I suspect. We've certainly taken weapons from different battlefields around the world and sorted out what they consist of, what the capabilities are, what their vulnerabilities are, so that we can develop weapons that can deal with those. You know, we famously brought tanks out, infantry fighting vehicles, others over the years. But no, I'm not aware of something like this in the past and then turning around and using it on the same enemy. What we should also be doing, though, is we should be learning from what the Ukrainians have done, which is nothing short of spectacular and on a scale that is way, way beyond what we're doing. When I was last there about 4 or 5 weeks ago, they told me that they will all together, all the companies, produce about 7 million drones this year. I think we'll produce 4 or maybe 500,000. So the scale of what they're doing and also the capability of what they have and the low cost of what they have is something from which we should learn as well.
Those numbers are staggering. Something else, we know that there is a campaign in the sky. There could also soon be boots on the ground, though, in Iran, according to President Trump aboard Air Force One last night.
Could there be? Possibly, for very good reason. Have to be very good reason. And I would say if we ever did that, they would be so decimated that they wouldn't be able to fight at the ground level.
There's some new reporting this morning, various outlets, that the president is talking about maybe going in and securing some of the uranium facilities that are possibly unsecured. What do you think? Should the president put boots on the ground in Iran?
Well, what I do think is that he shouldn't rule them out, and I think he's been correct in doing that. I think that previous presidents have prematurely ruled out various options that we should have kept alive, at least in the mind of the enemy. I think he'll be very, very careful in making that decision and carrying out whatever might be done. It's possible you could have some sneakers on the ground, some of the individuals from my old organization perhaps helping some of the opposition elements, maybe some very special Special Operations Forces members or something, but they're not going to be on the front lines. They'll be the advise, assist, and enable elements. There's been talk of actually seizing Karg Island, which is the big oil export location. It's just offshore, well up into the Gulf. And then again, the report that you mentioned about going in to secure the uranium. I suspect that the massive ordnance penetrator would probably obviate the need for that, the 30,000-pound precision munition that only we have, and only we have a plane that can drop it. But I'm sure he'll weigh this very, very carefully, having repeatedly noted the challenges of boots on the ground in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
And it sounds like, so far, according to the president, the top two tiers of the Iranian leaders have been totally wiped out. Now there are many mini Iranian command posts spread out all over the country. The Wall Street Journal calls it a mosaic. This is part of their piece. It says, the plan includes implementing a so-called mosaic defense, a decentralized approach that allows individual commanders the autonomy to keep up the fight if cut off from their superiors. You have studied wars in the Middle East for a long time. Can this kind of a mosaic defense that the Iranians are doing actually hold up?
Oh, it can, absolutely. You're talking about a regime force in total. So you're talking about the Revolutionary Guards Corps, the regime force, the besieged militia, the pipe swingers killing people on the streets during demonstrations, national police, the regular Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine. This is 1 million men under arms who have shown a willingness to kill their own citizens in the tens of thousands in January alone during the demonstrations. And they have it very obvious, I think, from the very beginning, because we took out the senior leaders, took out their headquarters, their means of command, control, communications, and so forth. So it was very clear that there has been a delegation of authority, a decentralization, as you termed it, to a number of these lower and mid-level leaders to continue the fight with the assets that they have on hand. And of course, what we've been doing is trying to go after, in particular, the missile launchers and missile stockpiles, and then we'll do the factories as well as now the drones. We've had great success against the missiles. Their launch numbers are down by nearly 90% or so, but there still are some coming. The drones have been a bit more steady, and those have been problematic, even though a number of the countries in the region, especially the UAE, have done very impressively against them and have been taking them down with low-cost, short-range air defense systems rather than $2 million Patriot missile interceptors. That's not good math.
And General Petraeus, my last question. It seems like the beginning parts of Epic Fury have been a big success, overall a big success for the United States. As you look at this, what is your biggest worry about the next couple weeks?
Well, I think President Trump actually captured it quite well, and I thought he was very forthright in stating that the worst outcome would be that the regime survives and another hardline ideological cleric takes the place of Khamenei. That would be problematic. That would mean that we're going to see this again and perhaps again. That's very challenging for a region which has built its brand around security and great infrastructure and great opportunities, visionary leadership, and so forth. So I think that's a huge concern. There's another number of ancillary concerns that are not trivial. The price of Brent crude. We're watching, it is now well over $93 a barrel. It was in the low to mid 60s before all of this started. It could go higher if the markets sense that freedom of navigation through the Gulf and then the Strait of Hormuz, and then on the other side, the Bab el-Mandeb, where the Yemeni Houthis have disrupted operations over time, and we think that might start again. That could be problematic as well. Really, I think it's going to come down, though, to a sense of how well have we done against the military objectives, noting that it's not the military's job to bring about regime change. It's the military's job to create conditions in which political transition could take place if, in fact, there is sufficient internal opposition to the regime. But again, keeping in mind that that regime is nearly 1 million men under arms, you'd have to have a very considerable force, people who are armed, organized, capable, well-led, to take that on. And I think that's why most analysts right now believe that the base case is the regime survives. Then the question is, what is the character of the new supreme leader? Will he be a bit pragmatic or not? And if or not, then there are going to be further challenging times ahead.
General David Petraeus, that was great. And you'd set up our next block perfectly. So thank you very much for coming to the Sunday briefing.
Good to be with you, Peter. Thank you.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.